Ever since Pokémon X and Y released in 2013, the series' reputation has been on a noticeable decline. Despite the growing sales numbers for these recent Pokémon games, the opinion of them has completely flipped. What was once one of the most universally beloved franchises in gaming has increasingly become known for disappointment and perceived lack of effort. Each new mainline entry since X and Y has been met with growing criticism, and the community sentiment has shifted from excitement for new releases to frustration. There's a multitude of videos and lengthy discussions specifically focused on the series' supposed downfall, highlighting its immense number of downsides such as difficulty, lack of post-game content, and route design. However, that raises a question. Has Pokemon games really gotten worse, and is the overwhelming criticism of the modern games justified? There are so many different things to discuss, but let's commence with the comparison of the environment and the overall appearance of the world. This is definitely one of the topics that comes up the most regarding the recent Pokemon games, as some people love the 2D visuals of the first 5 generations significantly more than one showcase in newer generations. Towards the beginning of this massive switch in style, a portion of the community overlooked the graphics, as they anticipated it becoming better as newer games came out, and the developers adjusted to the alteration. Despite the positive outlook, as more games were released, some people argue that they paled in comparison to many other 3D titles available on the same hardware. Now, these opinions might be a little exaggerated, so let's start with the mainline game that introduced the series of 3D, X and Y. X and Y visuals are typically not considered outstanding, being mostly described as somewhat appealing. For the art style, it attempted to be a mixture of 2D and 3D games, having chibi-style character models that heavily differentiated itself from other games. These characters weren't excessively chibi, creating a balance for the game that fit the Pokemon aesthetic. People certainly enjoyed the art style and environment design for its ambitiousness and originality, with it going on them as more 3DS Pokemon games were launched. On top of all this, viewing the different 3D model upgrades of hundreds of Pokemon alongside new idle and attack animations felt truly special, showcasing the immense effort dedicated to making the switch. As expected from transitioning to a completely 3D environment, the world felt much more alive. This synchronized perfectly with the different features and battles, as Game Freak emphasized weather conditions impacting the look of the battle, which was previously limited due to the game's 2D nature. For instance of this, grassy areas like forests on the majority of connecting routes between cities had slight wind breezes, accompanied with leaves blowing around the Pokemon. The trend of captivity remained in other atmospheres, as highlighted in battles in the desert and other mountain areas where slight dust is seen blowing around. This was a massive revamp in comparison to Black and White 2, where the backgrounds of battles rarely had mechanics corresponding to the player's position. These are obviously minor details, but in combination, work together to create a more engaging experience and distinguish itself from 2D games. Therefore, despite certain models and textures being depicted as simple or a downgrade, it still excels in numerous areas. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire retained a similar style, but everything felt much cleaner and polished. It expanded on the already vibrant colors X and Y had, being an upgrade to the original games, which were limited in illustration. For the Generation 7 games, Sun and Moon pushed the series to its maximum quality on the 3DS. They completely dropped the chibi models and switched to full-body ones to represent the characters. It definitely feels strange viewing the games next to older titles, but it undeniably made the game look better, especially since characters could demonstrate more personality with their animations. Moreover, for the world itself, it solved a major issue in X and Y, of the different buildings and terrain being minuscule. The fixed top camera angle used for the majority of the game only worsened this problem, making the games less realistic and similar to the previous 2D installments. For Sun and Moon, it matched traditional 3D games with its expansive towns and environments, creating a great exploration experience everywhere. Furthermore, it embellished the addition of background animations by improving camera movement. The camera angles and switches were dynamic, constantly zooming in or out on various Pokemon, and showcasing different perspectives of the battles. From these improvements, it was evident they took more advantage of the 3D shift, and it's displayed perfectly throughout the game. The difference is honestly bigger than most people remember, and lack of praise potentially stems from criticism of the other areas. Ultra Sun and Moon were great conclusions to the 3DS games, and overall for the 4 installments available, they were visually impressive. Now, they don't possess universal reception in this area, especially the Generation 6 games, due to different factors including performance issues, straightforward town design, and unpolished animations. Nevertheless, they became refined over time, and the superiority of 3D was certainly portrayed. Considering the numerous positives we just discussed for the 3DS games, the expectation was high for the subsequent titles on the Switch. It heavily outclassed the 3DS in functionality, having a larger screen and better components throughout the entire console. However, fans were eventually disappointed with each iteration, and the Switch games utterly failed at maximizing the Switch's performance capabilities. Let's start with the final Generation 7 games, Let's Go Eevee and Pikachu. Now, there's not too much to comment on for these games, as despite the console change, the style remained interchangeable to Ultra Sun and Moon. The camera angle is still fixed, in addition to focusing on routes and towns, being a remake of the original Pokémon game. Regardless of the resemblance, the game is assessed as one of the best looking games for the series. Its appearance and animations highlight a smoothness that was absent on 3DS titles. The game is just breathtaking in numerous locations around the map, such as Cerulean Cave, the Viridian Forest, and different water spots. It set a new visual standard for what Pokemon could look like on the Switch, a standard that, unfortunately, the next entries struggled to meet. The following title, Sword and Shield, took a different approach. Rather than focusing on polish, they aimed to expand the gameplay itself, introducing wild areas with countless freely roaming Pokemon ready to battle. Consequently, the visual quality worsened in comparison to the other 3D games. In particular, the wild area was criticized for its lackluster graphics. People immediately noticed the trees, mountains, and other terrain were pixelated, being void of definition. This problem was worsened by similar performance issues to the ones Ultra Sun and Moon displayed, with frequent frame rate drops and lag. The game even had pop-in models for the Pokemon, trees, and other players, being a massive downside for a game released in the year 2019. Although, it wasn't all terrible because aside from the wild areas, the towns and routes excelled appearance-wise. They emphasized the UK inspiration with the various building structures placed throughout each town, and improved the scale of them as well, with greater building heights. Moreover, the move animations became better cinematically, especially the Dynamax and Signature G-Max moves, which both felt unprecedented for a Pokemon game. Turn-based games partially depend on insane animations on skills for exciting battles, thus making the new animations expressive was a great step in the right direction. Therefore, while the game didn't quite meet certain expectations, it was still pleasing to look at. Let's transition to the next game, Legends Arceus, which alongside the Let's Go games, is routinely praised as one of the best looking Pokemon titles ever. It seemed to become more accustomed to the Switch's better hardware, with modern visuals that compare to the other stunning games. The visual upgrade of the entire world is important, but what truly stands out are the animations. Notably, there are moments like catching Pokemon. When you throw a Pokeball, there's a noticeable arc and speed to it, accompanied by a gust of wind trailing behind it. The impact feels weighty and satisfying, as the ball slams into the Pokemon with a sense of force, creating a small burst that adds to the realism of the moment. This extends to both the environment and the animations for different moves. Taking into account the world's scale and open structure, Legends Arceus distinguished itself in this area, greatly enhancing its gameplay. The final game to cover is Scarlet and Violet, which stands in stark contrast to Legends Arceus and marks the beginning of Generation 9. While Gen 8 and Gen 7 showed a similar art style that was just beginning to feel polished and appealing, Gen 9 took a different path, one that completely shifted the direction of the series' visual identity. The game moved away from the traditional anime-inspired look that had been a staple of Pokémon since Gen 1. In its place, Scarlet and Violet adopted a more grounded, realistic aesthetic. The colors are less saturated, giving the world a muted, earthy tone. Moreover, the terrain is rougher, with more visual detail in places like the multiple stone walls, high-arcing mountains, desert areas, and grassy fields. Overall, people view Scarlet and Violet as a step back from Sword and Shield and especially Legends Arceus. It's immensely disappointing for a modern game to be so unappealing. This was presumably due to changing the aesthetic of newer games they've been developing for several of the previous installments. The negative impact the performance and presentation caused on the game's quality cannot be overstated. Comparing Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet to other Switch games like the open world Zelda titles, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and Mario Odyssey showcases a major difference in visuals. The only Pokemon games that visually align with Nintendo's most breathtaking first-party titles are Legends Arceus and the Let's Go games. Unfortunately, both Sword and Shield, which followed Let's Go, and Scarlet and Violet, which was released after Legends Arceus, show a noticeable drop in detail across all areas. There are various reasons for the lack of stunning Pokemon games being released. An obvious one is development time. It is difficult to produce a good-looking game without several performance issues or throwing a year period between games. This is why most games, with the exception of sports titles, have moved away from the demanding release formula. It allows for better looking, more polished experiences, even on weaker hardware such as the Switch. Pokemon in particular could benefit from longer development cycles, given the sheer number of models, animations, and moves that need to be created and maintained. Now, let's look at the transition from 2D to 3D in mainline Pokemon titles and how they compare. Surprisingly, many people consider the 2D games to have a cleaner, more polished visual style. The sprite work in those entries was detailed and expressive, with Black and White even introducing battle animations that added life to each encounter. This distinct art direction remains a favorite, with some arguing that Pokemon should have never made the Switch. No pun intended. The 2D format also benefited Game Freak from a development standpoint. With fewer technical demands, the team could focus more on game design, storytelling, and other core features. In contrast, the 3D era brought numerous challenges. For example, many models or areas appear stiff and underwhelming. Although this is consistently being improved, for Scarlet and Violet, the overall visual quality still falls short of expectations. Additionally, route design has seen a noticeable decline. Regions like Sinnoh and Unova feature dynamic, creatively structured paths. By comparison, routes in newer games, such as the different routes of Galar, feel simplistic and lack both visual variety and depth. While the recent entries of Legends Arceus and Scarlet and Violet moved away from traditional route structures in favor of open world exploration, it's worth highlighting how much earlier games were able to achieve within a more limited format. Beyond region layouts, one aspect typically overlooked is the ability to view the influences of various countries. Leading up to Unova, every region was inspired from different Japanese places, but Unova set a precedent with its basis on New York City. Gen 6 launched right after Black and White 2, switching to 3D while simultaneously making France's influences feel significantly more prevalent. Specifically, Lumio City depicts Paris, with different city sections surrounding the Eiffel Tower. They're filled with attractions like clothing shops, restaurants, and cafes, improving the city's engagement. The dynamic camera angle permitted with 3D is especially emphasized here, as it switches to different angles of the character to navigate the city. This is further noticeable in future games, as demonstrated in Sun and Moon, when there are a multitude of mini-games related to Hawaii, such as the Mantine Surfing, which is only possible in 3D. Thus, 3D possesses a massive advantage over 2D in this regard, and the gap will continue to widen for new entries. In terms of Pokemon designs, people have varying opinions, because unlike the multiple of the other aspects we discussed, designs are completely subjective. Your personal values matter substantially when rating designs, and factors such as the color, or if a Pokemon is bipedal, usually heavily alters opinions on whether or not you think they have improved, gotten worse, or stayed at a similar level. Despite the occasional criticism of modern designs, it's clear they have sustained themselves, if they are viewed in totality. People critical of newer generations often point to simple or uninspired designs, citing examples like Klefki, Beware, Wooloo, and Lechonk. However, basic designs have always existed in every generation, even before Kalos. Voltorb is literally a Pokeball with eyes. Murkrow is just a crow with a hat-shaped crest. Zigzagoon is a raccoon with a zigzag pattern. Bidoof is based on a mountain beaver and has always been labeled one of the worst designs. Then there's Salk, who's a blue human in a martial arts uniform. The point here isn't to say that all or most Pokemon designs are bad. Rather, it's to highlight that with Game Freak designing about 100 new Pokemon each generation, some will inevitably be simpler or less imaginative than others. This has always been the case, and will likely continue as the series moves forward. The presence of a few basic designs in newer games isn't a sign of declining quality. Instead, it's a consistent part of how the franchise has always operated. While simple designs are commonly a part of the series, they're usually balanced by good ones. In X and Y, we saw the introduction of fan favorites like Greninja, Goodra, Sylveon, Yveltal, and Aegislash, alongside appealing Mega Evolutions such as Mega Charizard X, Mega Lucario, and Mega Gengar. Southern Moon followed with equally memorable designs, including the fully evolved starters Kommo-o, Lurantis, and Lycanroc, all being exceptional, as did the created regional variants like Alolan Ninetales and Marowak. The generation's uniqueness was further amplified by the mysterious and otherworldly Ultra Beast, which brought entirely new concepts to Pokemon design. In Sword and Shield, while often viewed as one of the weaker entries design-wise, there are still good designs. The box art legendaries, Rillaboom, Dragapult, and Centiskorch all bring strong concepts to the Pokédex, as do the Galarian forms like Weezing and Moltres. Even the G-Max forms, though not universally popular, showcase creative ideas, especially in designs like G-Max Cinderace, Alcremie, and Toxtricity. Scarlet and Violet continues this trend, featuring impressive designs such as the starter evolutions, Garganacl, Goldango, and again, the box art legendaries. While the Paldean forms may not have been as important as previous regional variants, the generation still offers an assortment of memorable Pokemon. This all shows that even after designing over 1,000 Pokemon, the series continues to deliver great designs for each new generation. And as always, design preferences are subjective. Some designs I love might not resonate with you, and vice versa, which is the beauty of the various design styles. One area that's hard to overlook in the newer games that's related to its visuals is the technical performance. While past titles were generally stable, Scarlet and Violet launched with an overwhelming amount of bugs and glitches. It's suspected for any large game to have a few issues at release, but in this case, the problems were so frequent and disruptive that they became a major part of the conversation around the game on release. From players clipping through walls, Pokemon floating in mid-air, and even walking through buildings, the game felt completely unfinished. Though many of these issues were eventually patched, dropping a $60 title in such a rough state left a terrible first impression. Moreover, it reflects a larger issue with how rushed recent Pokemon games have felt, likely due to tight deadlines. Since Pokemon titles rarely face delays, with Diamond and Pearl being a rare exception, Scarlet and Violet had to release on schedule, regardless of its quality. Now, bugs and glitches aren't exclusive to the newer games. Even the first Pokemon titles had some, with the most famous one being the Mew glitch in the original Red and Blue. Since Mew wasn't attainable through normal gameplay, people discovered a workaround using in-game glitches. Unlike today, where patches can be rushed out to fix issues post-launch, those older games couldn't be updated. Once the game officially released, that version was final, unless the cartridge was eventually redistributed. While later generations also had their own glitches, they instead revolved around item duplication or accessing unattainable Pokemon, and not game-breaking problems. Comparing this to the current state of Pokemon games highlights a major issue. Despite modern games being significantly more ambitious, they're still expected to release on a strict schedule. As a result, crucial aspects like polish are no longer the primary focus, often impacting the player experience the most during launch, time where first impressions mattered the most. In addition to visuals, bugs, and Pokemon designs, one of the most consistent criticisms of recent games is a lack of difficulty. While it's true that Pokemon games were never particularly known for being especially challenging, the drop in difficulty has become more noticeable in newer generations, likely to make the games more accessible to newer and casual players. There are multiple reasons for this shift, but one of the most prominent ones is the introduction of battle gimmicks unique to each generation. These mechanics are meant to give each game its own identity, being critical for enjoyability and competitive play, while also empowering the player. The main ones we see are Mega Evolutions, Z-moves, Dynamax and Gigantamax forms, and most recently, Terrestrialize. They certainly add flash and variety to battles, but they also tend to tilt the balance heavily in the player's favor, making encounters easier. Gimmicks definitely contribute to the overall simple nature of battles, especially when a player has access to them while most opponents do not. A clear example of this is in X and Y, where players unlock Mega Evolution as early as the 3rd gym. Not only are they given a free Mega Lucario, but they also receive a Kanto starter and Torchic if you bought the game near launch, both capable of Mega Evolving. All these Pokemon are strong even in competitive play, so having them so early makes you incredibly overpowered. The 100 base stat increase alone makes Mega Evolution have a massive advantage, but their abilities complement them perfectly. In particular, Mega Lucario gains one of the best abilities upon Mega Evolving, called Adaptability, making stab moves do 2 times the original damage as opposed to 1.5 times. Thus, Lucario just destroys everything. And honestly, it's ridiculous he's given out so early. Even in comparison to free Pokemon given out in other games, they're typically unevolved forms of powerful Pokemon, like the Riola egg gifted from exploring the cave on Isle Island with Riley, and Sinnoh, or the Larvesta egg given from a Pokemon Ranger in Black and White. For X and Y, despite having the ability to Mega Evolve early on, throughout the entire game, only 2 major opponents, Lysandre, the Team Flare leader, and Diantha, who is the champion, use Mega Evolutions. And funnily enough, both of the Mega Pokemon are weak to Mega Lucario. Surprisingly, this improved in Sun and Moon. The first opponent to use a Z move appears as early as the first Grand Trial, and many important trainers afterwards, including all members of the Elite Four, also use them. This approach creates a much more balanced experience by ensuring that the challenge scales alongside the player's capabilities. This trend fortunately continued into Sword and Shield, and Scarlet and Violet. However, even when opponents do use the gimmick, it still gives the player an advantage. You could definitely use it more effectively than the AI, and in many cases, you have multiple Pokemon that can take advantage of it, while the opposing trainer is frequently limited to just one. Gimmicks can also be combined with items or stronger moves, further increasing their strength and tipping the balance in your favor. In contrast, the first 5 generations of Pokemon didn't feature any battle alternate features. Instead, gameplay improvements focused on refining core mechanics, such as the introduction of double battles or the physical special split in Gen 4. Because of this, battles in those earlier games relied more heavily on matchups, strategy, and pure skill. As a result, they undeniably felt more challenging and led to some of the most memorable moments in the series. While gimmicks can add style, they typically lessen difficulty, and in turn, the lasting impact of battles themselves. Despite their drawbacks, gimmicks are ultimately a positive addition to the series. Many long-running franchises, especially those with frequent releases, are criticized for a lack of innovation. As we mentioned previously, sports games are an example. With each yearly release only offering minor changes, many fans have grown tired of the repetitive gameplay and visuals. You could argue that Pokémon was heading down a similar path prior to X and Y. Each game followed a nearly identical structure. You talk to a few people, get your starter, then discover different areas around the map, while battling rivals, trainers, the 8 gym leaders, the Elite Four, and a champion. Without the introduction of gimmicks, the experience of exploring new regions and battling opponents will risk becoming stale. These mechanics, while sometimes unbalanced, have helped keep each new generation feeling fresh and distinct. Another major reason the newer games feel easier is a highly controversial party-wide XP share system. This feature distributes experience points to every Pokemon in the player's party, even those who didn't participate in battle. The active Pokemon on the field receives 100% of the XP, while the remaining members are given 50%. This system was first introduced in X and Y as a part of the other major changes to the series. At the time, it was viewed as a negative addition, largely because it was implemented as a key item that could be simply turned off. Players who wanted a more challenging game could just disable it, allowing for more control over the game's difficulty. Unfortunately, this toggle option was removed in the Let's Go games, forcing players to use a party-wide XP share. This decision was heavily criticized, as many people have relied on disabling it to create more challenging gameplay and encourage greater team variety during battles. The change also contrasted how XP share worked in the earlier generations. Initially, it was a held item found in specific locations. Once equipped, it will only allow a single Pokemon to share experience with the one that earned it in battle. This more limited version made team management and leveling a more thoughtful process. By comparison, the modern version simplifies progression, making it easier to maintain a fully leveled team with minimal effort. While this does benefit casual players, it reduces the overall sense of challenge that older games offered. However, despite the common perception, newer Pokemon games aren't necessarily easier than older ones because of XP share. Instead, they're less grindy. Look at the XP share system like this. It allows your entire party to gain experience, but it doesn't make you drastically over-level. It simply keeps your team around the level of the trainers you face. In contrast, if you play the pre-Gen 6 games, you often have to spend hours grinding to correspond to the level of tougher fights, especially the Elite Four. If party-wide XP share had existed in those generations, it presumably wouldn't have reduced the difficulty, merely the time spent grinding. In that sense, it's more a convenience feature than a change to the game's challenge. Nevertheless, this streamlined leveling process does affect overall pacing. With the less training required, players can quickly move from gym to gym, shortening the length of the game. Personally, I completed Y, Shield, and Violet in around 20 hours each, whereas older games like Emerald or Platinum took me closer to 40 hours, largely because of the time spent preparing for the hardest battles. The anomaly is Ultra Sun, which is known for its lengthiness, but ironically is described as one of the most difficult Pokemon games in general due to tonal battles, further showcasing the connection. While this may not be a problem for everyone, it does impact the adventure that older Pokemon games were known for, where each victory felt more significant. For a more minor but recognizable change in difficulty, it's concerning how rival battles have been handled. Traditionally, rivals would choose a starter that had a type advantage over yours, creating more of a challenge, in addition to making their face-off entertaining. Starting in Generation 7, however, this was disappointingly reversed, as rivals began selecting the starter weak to yours. For instance, in Ultra Sun and Moon, the final champion battle against Hao features a decently built team with strong type coverage and solid levels. Yet, instead of choosing the counter to your starter, he mirrors your choice at the beginning, throughout each battle in the game. So if you picked Popplio, he uses Cineroar instead of Decidueye, which is the opposite of the previous games. This change aligns with a shift in rival characterization. Rivals are no longer positioned as antagonists. They're now written more as supportive friends. For X and Y, you're surrounded by an entire friend group, each serving as a rival, but being relatively friendly, a trend that mostly continued in the later titles. While this friendlier tone adds charm, it also contributes to a more relaxed atmosphere and reduces the competitiveness that earlier games had. For longtime fans, this could potentially make rival encounters feel less meaningful and less memorable compared to the tense, recurring battles of previous generations, which is something routinely pointed out as a downside. There are several other changes that contribute to the reduced difficulty of the more casual nature of recent titles. For example, starting in Sun and Moon, type effectiveness indicators were added to moves once a Pokemon is registered in the Pokédex, removing the need to remember every matchup and playthroughs. Powerful items have also become more accessible, further simplifying battles. Altogether, these features work to create an easier experience. Older titles are often revered for the higher difficulty, largely because they lack such quality of life features. battle gimmicks, or the party-wide XP system. However, the impact of reduced difficulty on overall game quality is over-exaggerated. Pokemon didn't become one of the most iconic gaming franchises because it was hard. Its appeal derives from the immersive universe, the thrill of capturing unique creatures, battling with them in a simple yet addictive turn-based system, and exploring creative regions. Countless games have tried to replicate that formula, but none have come close to matching Pokemon's success, making its popularity long-lasting. Additionally, the Game Freak has started to innovate in other areas. Trials replaced gyms in Sun and Moon, and Scarlet and Violet had open-world exploration that lets you complete challenges in any order. The uniqueness of each region definitely outshines the lackluster difficulty. At its core, Pokemon is supposed to be a simple and cozy experience, and recent titles have merely leaned more into that. While the series has clearly leaned into a more accessible experience, let's go into another element that has progressed significantly over time: the story. Early Pokemon games weren't known for the narrative depth. In fact, they barely had any at all. In the Kanto region, for example, the story is minimal. The player moves from town to town, occasionally encountering members of Team Rocket, resulting in a final confrontation with Giovanni at Viridian City Gym. The emphasis was placed solely on battling Team Rocket rather than plot development. The lack of memorable moments contributes to the overall simple nature of the region. Johto follows a similar structure, with scattered encounters involving Team Rocket and a more prominent moment at the radio tower, but even then, the story remains relatively straightforward compared to the future regions. It wasn't until the Horn region that the series began to experiment with more complex storytelling. The introduction of two opposing villainous teams in Emerald, Team Aqua, and Team Magma certainly added much needed tension and unpredictability that the previous titles lacked. The conflicting goals to expand the sea or land created an engaging dynamic. In contrast, Team Rocket had an unclear goal, reflecting the views of unimportant villains of various games. The only downside is it felt incoherent, as you encountered the teams rather spontaneously. An aspect they both failed at portraying is a motive, but Emerald focusing on two teams helped this allure. This storytelling shift was further enhanced by Rayquaza's appearance at the climax of the game, which is one of the series' first major cutscenes. It highlighted the powerfulness of Rayquaza, coming from the sky, then casually roaring to prevent Groudon and Kyogre from battling. Viewing it currently is amusing due to its slowness, but it was an impressive moment for a Game Boy Advance title. This marked a turning point in the franchise, with narrative becomes a more prominent component of the games. Following Hoenn, the Sinnoh region built on this. It maintains the team format, with Team Galactic being the main antagonist, led by one of the most compelling villains in the series, Cyrus. His emotionless demeanor and goal to erase the world and recreate it in his own image set a darker tone for the story. The reasoning for this goal and general lack of emotions is interesting as well. Cyrus believed emotions were pointless, as the negative ones humans expressed were the cause of conflict and the world's dysfunction. The game's structure also supports this narrative well, especially through the involvement of the three-legged guardians, Mesprit, Azelf, and Uxie. The early sighting of Mesprit at Lake Verity creates some foreshadowing that pays off later when each lake becomes a main point of Team Galactic's plan. The climax of the story takes place at the Spear Pillar, being one of the most iconic locations in the series. In Platinum, this leads to entering the Distortion World, a surreal, gravity-defying realm that uses shifting perspectives, floating platforms, and eerie visuals to create a void-style atmosphere. This setting goes perfectly with the final confrontation with Cyrus, in addition to creating a mystery surrounding his fate, as he disappears into the Distortion World after his defeat. The Sinnoh storyline is easily one of the best within the franchise, as it feels more complex by blending world building, memorable locations, and having a great champion battle in Cynthia. The Unova region is also regarded as having one of the strongest stories in the Pokemon series. Unlike many of the previous antagonist groups, Team Plasma displayed a moral ideology, stating that Pokemon should be liberated from humans, rather than simply seeking power or control. This created a conflict that made you question the ethics of the Pokemon world. The leader was N, who gradually developed throughout the game. He believed humans were harming Pokemon, but N's worldview begins to change as he battles you and witnesses bonds between trainers and their teams. Unova is mostly praised for its ambition, compelling characters, and its attempt to challenge the player's views. In contrast to Unova, the story of Kalos is often criticized for its lack of depth. The lore surrounding Mega Evolution and the Ancient War is interesting, being even enough to inspire an upcoming game in Legends ZA. However, the execution within X and Y falls short, as Mega Evolution needed more focus. Team Flare comes across as underdeveloped as well, with their leader Lysandre pursuing a generic goal of reshaping the world using a regional device. Although it introduces interesting themes, particularly through historical references and legendary Pokemon, it lacks the emotional aspect and character development found in other regions. The story isn't inherently bad, but when compared to the previous games like Sinnoh or Unova, it feels uninspired. In the Alola region, the story takes a unique approach. As opposed to making you the center of the main conflict, the story primarily followed Lily, who most people feel served as the actual protagonist. This change was well received because Lily's character arc was genuinely compelling. Her transformation from timid to someone capable of standing up to Lusamine was one of the best developments in the series. The climax surpasses that of Unova or Sinnoh, facing Ultra Necroza, being notorious for its difficulty. It felt like an actual boss battle seen in other games, as you couldn't simply catch it. One downside is Lusamine's obsession with Ultra Beasts not being entirely clear or explored. This is a problem with other main antagonists in Pokemon, and Lusamine is no exception. The satisfying resolution somewhat makes up for this, delivering one of the most heartfelt conclusions to a villain arc. Adding on to the narrative is the post-game. Post-game content is often forgettable from a story perspective, but Alola stood out. The premise involved past generation leaders and champions. It was of course nostalgic, but made for some challenging battles. Before getting into the Switch games, it's worth highlighting the absence of voice acting in Pokemon. Nearly every major story-driven game today includes voice acting, which adds to the overall experience, especially in games with long dialogue sequences. However, Pokemon still doesn't have it. That seems like it's not changing anytime soon. It's noticeable now that most games, even smaller ones, frequently include voice acting. Xenoblade Chronicles 3, for example, is praised for its great voice acting and also a Switch exclusive. It only sold 1.6 million copies by March 2023. Meanwhile, Scarlet and Violet, released that same year, and sold over 10 million copies in just its first weekend. Considering Pokemon generates significant revenue from the games, it's clearly a matter of time and effort. In particular, Xenoblade 3 had 4 years of development, while Scarlet and Violet only had 3. And in that time, Game Freak made a DLC and 2 other games. If the release schedule remains this packed, voice acting presumably won't be added, which will continue preventing the series from reaching its full potential. Despite the lack of voice acting, Galar's story wasn't without its merits. Rather than following the traditional formula of an evil team, the game instead concentrated on a single antagonist, being Rose. While the shift in structure was unique, it ultimately made the story feel less engaging, especially leading up to the final competition with Eternatus. There definitely wasn't enough build-up compared to other games because it was sacrificed for a surprising moment. The problem being, that moment wasn't immensely interesting, or at least not enough to justify the simplistic story before it. That said, there were a few exciting moments. For instance, encountering the box art legendaries in the slumbering world early in the game added a sense of mystery, and the final battle, taking on the form of a raid, complete with the assistance of Zacian or Zamazenta, was amazing. Being great to finally have the legendaries on our side. Nevertheless, the plot lacked the depth and tension seen in earlier entries. They attempted to try something new similar to Gen 7, but this story pointed out returning to a more team-based structure in the future will result in better narratives. Finally, we had the most recent story from Scarlet and Violet, which has been widely praised. This time, Game Freak took another fresh approach by introducing 3 distinct storylines: Victory Road, Path of Legends, and Starfall Street. Each one could be completed in any order, which complemented the open world design perfectly. Moreover, all 3 narratives tied together for the finale in Area Zero, culminating in a climactic battle against Koraidon or Miraidon. Paldea's story is organized, while still including emotional moments and avoiding the development issues of Sword and Shield. This is further enhanced by the rival, Nemona, who is seemingly closer in attitude to rivals found in the first 5 generations. They found the ideal balance towards friendly, but also having a competitive drive, giving hope to future rivals. Taking into account all these storylines, it's clear the series' storytelling has fluctuated in strength. Certain games do aspects better than others, which doesn't highlight a dramatic decrease in quality. There's also numerous factors we didn't discuss that improve the story. For example, cutscenes have gotten better, particularly for the Switch games, which permitted better looking cutscenes due to its hardware. Another factor is a greater cohesiveness. Multiple times throughout the older games, certain moments or events felt relatively random. In comparison, newer games tend to be more structured, with fewer of these surprises. Finally, it's important to mention the character movement during dialogue. As we discussed before, older games lack this feature because of the capability of older consoles. Nowadays, every story game emphasizes it, due to the substantial value it adds. It undoubtedly makes story games more engaging. It works great in combination with vibrant visuals and realistic character models. A portion of these go without saying, but it's still essential to consider them when differentiating the level of stories. Overall, the story in modern games is typically intriguing, and the constant innovation of additional stories with different structures immensely aids its appeal. Alongside these different but still great story formulas is an aspect that often gets overlooked, being the addition of quality of life features. These small changes improve the overall experience, yet they're rarely brought up in reviews or discussions, especially when conversations lean more negative. One of the biggest quality of life improvements has to be the removal of HMs. In all the titles before Sun and Moon, HMs were mandatory if you wanted to progress through the game. That meant sacrificing move slots on your Pokémon just to use abilities like Cut, or remove trees, or dive to explore underwater areas. While these mechanics were interactive, they felt more like annoying roadblocks than meaningful gameplay, and their removal made the game feel less restrictive. HMs limited the freedom to build your team however you wanted. Unless you were near a PC, you always had to carry a Pokemon that could use the various HMs. It started with only 5 in Red and Blue, and while only 3 was technically required to beat the game, moves like Flash and Fly were useful. That's already 5 out of the 24 total move slots taken up by utility moves, and most HMs were limited to just 3 types, making them even less versatile in battle. Things got worse in Hoenn, which introduced a total of 8 HMs, 5 of which were required to beat the game. Even though they were spread across 4 types, that was sometimes a downside. For instance, unless you had certain Pokemon that could learn the multiple water type HMs, despite not being water types themselves, you end up teaching one Pokemon 3 different water moves to move forward. A common workaround in older games was to dedicate a single Pokemon to learning multiple HMs across different types. This meant using a team slot only for utility, and not because you enjoyed the design. Generation 4 in particular is occasionally criticized for its heavy reliance on HMs. Similar to Hoenn, you needed 8 HMs to progress through the game, with 6 being required. Default is technically optional, but it's almost a necessity due to how often it's used, bringing that number up to 7. What makes Sinnoh's implementation even worse is the frequency at which HMs are used, as you're using them more than in Hoenn, which makes walking around tedious. The power of these moves are typically disappointing as well. Cut, for instance, is a 50 power normal type move and only has 95% accuracy, making it one of the weakest HM moves. For Defog, it's a strong move competitively as it clears hazards and screens, but in a regular playthrough where trainers rarely set up field effects, it's nearly useless. Flash suffers from a similar issue because it just lowers accuracy and doesn't deal any damage. Rock Smash is another underwhelming move with only 40 base power and a chance to lower defense, but that definitely doesn't justify its inclusion in a main team moveset. HM usage improved significantly in Unova, where only Strength and Surf were required to beat Black and White 2. This trend continued in X and Y, where the only mandatory HMs were Strength and Surf, which were mostly used in Victory Road. However, it wasn't until Sun and Moon that Pokemon removed HMs, replacing them with Rod Pokemon. This was a great change as it finally allowed players to fully explore the region without compromising their team's moveset or slots. It also fit well with Alola's laid-back and convenience-focused atmosphere. Most notably, it still had environmental interaction. Thus, you could still clear obstacles and traverse terrain just without the outdated mechanic of HMs. In Sword and Shield, rare Pokemon were replaced with the upgraded bike system. The new bike allowed you to travel on water, replacing Surf or Lapras from Sun and Moon. This was paired with the Flying Taxi feature, which became available immediately after the first gym. In comparison to older titles where you couldn't use Fly until much later in the game, this was a great improvement, as you didn't need to backtrack. Then in Scarlet and Violet, traversal was tied to your legendary Rhydon or Koraidon. Their movement abilities like gliding, climbing, or swimming were unlocked gradually through the Path of Legends storyline. People didn't mind this design choice as it added a sense of progression and exploration while still allowing access to most areas early on. It also made sense narratively, with the box art legendaries slowly regaining their powers over time. The HM system is usually looked past when talking about the glory of older games, but it's especially noticeable when you play an older game after playing a modern game. Pokemon is an adventure game, and with new ways to traverse the world, all being fun and creative, it makes the game a lot better compared to its predecessors in that aspect. Along with HMs being completely replaced, DLCs are the new enhanced versions of third games. In the past, the better game would usually be the remakes a year later, such as Emerald or Ultra Sun and Moon. Now, DLCs come out instead, with Sword and Shield starting this trend. These expansions cost $30 per game compared to the $40 price tag of previous enhanced versions. Many people had already begun to criticize full-price enhanced editions, especially by the time Ultra Sun and Moon were released, as they offer relatively minor changes while requiring a full replay. DLCs, by contrast, allow you to continue with your existing save files while enjoying the added content. The changes introduced through DLC are also more substantial, as Sword and Shield offered 2 entirely new wild areas and storylines, significantly expanding the original game. This model not only saves players money, but also respects their time and progress. The only downside is any performance fixes or general small improvements won't be added to improve the base game. It's widely known Platinum did this for Diamond and Pearl, and with DLCs, these changes will no longer happen. Overall though, it's still a positive shift for Pokemon games. Sword and Shield also introduced raids, which were a great addition to the series. They allow you to battle powerful Pokemon with other people, often requiring coordination, specific movesets, and team strategies. This filled a gap in challenging PvE content, especially in later stages of the game. Raids became even more engaging with the DLC's Dynamax adventures, where you could capture shiny legendary Pokemon. Lastly, I want to highlight the convenience of relearning moves in Scarlet and Violet. You could do it directly from the menu without needing to visit a move relearner. This is a major quality of life improvement. I still remember during my first playthrough of Ultra Sun, accidentally skipping Primarina's signature move, Sparkling Aria. I had to wait all the way till Mount Lanakila at the end of the game to finally relearn it, and use a Z move, Oceanic Operetta. In Scarlet and Violet, that kind of inconvenience no longer exists. There's a clear trend of increasing convenience in the most recent games, especially with Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet. Features like raids, the ability to relearn moves from the menu, and quality of life upgrades like fast travel and HM replacements all reflect an effort to streamline gameplay. Without these updates, the more rushed elements of newer games, such as the technical issues, would be even more noticeable. The convenience they bring helps balance out the flaws, in addition to showing that the series is still evolving in the right direction. So, we finally reached the end, and based on the different elements we talked about, it's clear that the Pokemon series hasn't declined in quality. As with any long-running franchise, people will have different preferences of what they value most, whether it's story, design, gameplay mechanics, or performance. While some aspects have certainly changed over time, many of the main components have remained consistent, and several features have even improved. Despite all this, it's also important to evaluate recent Pokemon titles in the context of other major Switch games. The Switch had an exceptional lifespan, with the majority of Nintendo's biggest franchises reached their peak in popularity and quality. While the Pokemon series hasn't necessarily declined, it also hasn't reached the same heights. Earlier titles like Platinum continue to be praised for how well they handle various gameplay elements, and in some areas they still surpass the newer entries. As mentioned before, there are high expectations for the series when it transitioned to 3D, and it's fair to say that, for many fans, those expectations have not been fully met. What's promising though is the future of Pokemon games isn't looking too bad, as Legends ZA is releasing this October. Legends Arceus is widely considered the best modern Pokemon game, and even players who don't typically enjoy newer titles found it enjoyable. Its art style and innovative gameplay were highlights, and it seems like ZA will build on that formula. This time, it's combined with the lore of the Kalos region, which could further improve its appeal. Notably, Game Freak also skipped the 2024 release, which would normally be a remake, to presumably focus on this title. That decision suggested an emphasis on quality. Moreover, the return of the fan favorite Mega Evolutions, a mechanic that elevated both X and Y, and a Mega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, is another reason for the general excitement. As for Generation 10 and beyond, it appears Game Freak may be moving away from the 3-year release cycle for new generations they followed since 2013. One of the main issues with Scarlet and Violet was its rushed development, likely due to releasing a large-scale title like Legends Arceus in the same year. By avoiding this, Gen 10 is already positioned to be better than Scarlet and Violet. This shift could be a response to the criticism newer titles have received, and if it results in longer development times, it may lead to more well-received games in the future. Ultimately, Pokemon games have seen plenty of changes throughout the years, from mechanical overhauls and quality of life improvements to shifts in storytelling and visuals. While not every change has been perfect, the series continues to grow and adapt. That unmatched Pokemon experience these games have developed is certainly still there in recent games, and it's hard to say that these new titles have really gotten worse. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed, please like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next video.